welcome to this evening's event, Hey Utopia, Imagining a Better Future, as part of the Griffith University Advancement and Alumni series. My name's Ashley Hay and I'm the editor of Griffith Review. It's my pleasure to bring you a conversation that's grown out of our most recent edition, Griffith Review 73, Hey Utopia. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the landscape which holds our offices at Griffith University's South Bank campus in Brisbane. This place is the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. It sits alongside the waters of the Maiwar underneath this particular sky. I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people's elders, past and present and emerging, and I'd like to acknowledge too the particular privilege of being able to make a life here and share this place after their millennia of careful custodianship. Griffith Review is Australia's leading journal of great ideas and new writing. Each of its quarterly editions explore a particular theme or topic, a question that intersects with the zeitgeist, the matters of the moment, with what's going on. And it exists to offer space for a range of voices, from emerging to established writers, thinkers, academics and researchers, all sorts of people writing in all sorts of spaces across essays, reportage, fiction, memoir and more. We appreciate how very difficult life is for many people at the moment in lockdown. We hope that this discussion gives you the chance to escape, at least for a little while, maybe to have a think about some of those utopias. Hopefully many of you will have received a copy of this edition of Griffith Review in the post. It's your special gift from the very lovely people at the Griffith University Advancement Department. It's now my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Carolyn Evans, who is the Vice-Chancellor and President of Griffith University. Carolyn, I need to ask you, I think, to turn your camera on and unmute.
Thanks very much, Ashley, and good evening, everybody. Great pleasure to be with you this evening, wherever you're coming from. Can I join with Ashley in recognising the traditional custodians of all of the various lands on which we arrive at this digital session tonight. I too am on Turrbal and Yagara land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So about 18 months ago, we were trying to host an alumni event in Melbourne and then the next day in Sydney as the world sort of came tumbling down in March, and we ended up cancelling at the last minute. We've planned several times to try and host those events this year, but a border of one kind or another has always been up. A lockdown has been in place, whether here or in Melbourne or Sydney. And in the end, we've decided that while we would really love to be with you in person, and I'm sure those of you who are experiencing lockdown at the moment would really love the opportunity to be with us, we've decided that the best that we can offer you, I'm afraid, this time is some real intellectual stimulation provided, and we're very grateful for their support in this event, the wonderful Griffith Review and some of their marvellous authors. Before we turn over to the panel I know many of you are interested in hearing from, let me just begin with the 5 minutes to start by telling you a little bit about Griffith, how we've experienced the last 18 months since we've been able to be together at these alumni events. And what some of our wonderful students, staff and indeed alumni are doing. And if there's ever been a year where the Olympics and the Paralympics has provided us with some much needed distraction and some moments of great happiness, it's been 2021. And Griffith students, staff and alumni have just done amazingly at the Olympics, and we're in the midst of starting to do some really wonderful things in the Paralympics. Griffith students and alumni won 19 medals at the Olympics, and indeed on the international tallies, if Griffith was a country, we would have been the 11th ranked country in the world between Canada and France. So, you know, there are major international players that we won more medals at. Having Emma McKen as one of our alumni did help just a little bit, but in fact there were many, many alumni who've done well, and we've already won several gold and other medals in the Paralympics, and looking forward to sharing some of that news with you. Now, when we haven't had the wonderful distraction of Olympics and Paralympics, the last 18 months, it has to be acknowledged, has been incredibly challenging in so many ways, and the Griffith alumni here in Australia, and we're also really conscious of the Griffith alumni overseas, have had some very tough times that they've had to experience. But I think it's also been a time for many of us to focus on what's important. It's nothing like having things stripped away to start making you think about the things that really matter in your life. That might be health and well-being, mental well-being, the company of family and friends, the simple pleasures of being able to gather together with others for alumni events, sport, religion, recreation, study, a simple catch-up in a playground. And the last 18 months have also helped us as an institution, and indeed many institutions, focus on what's important to us. And tonight I want to just briefly share with you some reflections on 3 elements of the Griffith culture that have really come to the fore over the last 18 months and help us to get to a place where we do hope that we can start to see a more hopeful future, perhaps not utopia, but a place that where Griffith can have a strong and positive role. So I'd like to talk to you about people, about partnerships and about place. Got to start with people, because if there's anything that our COVID period has taught us, I hope we knew before then, but we certainly know now, it's just how incredibly important and remarkable our people are. Many Griffith staff and students were right there on the front lines, helping with everything from, of course, our students would be working in supermarkets, in aged care, in hospitals, volunteering to go out and spend some time with folks who might be vulnerable or shut in. And back early on in the crisis, when there was no sanitizer to be found outside the healthcare system, our pharmacy staff and students got together and made some for the community. When PPE was in short supply, even within the health system, our design and engineering folk got together with the 3D printer and printed 3D PPE that could be immediately used. As so many of you who are parents who would know, when parents suddenly were faced with having to help their students' education, their kids' education in a way they hadn't from homeschooling before, our education faculty put out a great range of resources. Some of you might want to check those out right now, I imagine. In short, when our community needed us, we tried to be there for them. And we did so while we were facing our own specific challenges. We had to roll over 1,000 courses online in the space of 3 weeks. And since our original lockdown, we've been in and out of lockdown, often with less than a day of notice. Now, that's hard for everybody. It's hard for staff. It's hard for students. It's hard for all those trying to provide online health and careers advice and alumni events. Everybody's just having to plan and do a lot by way of contingency. Some of the teaching online is relatively straightforward, but we teach musical theatre, sculpture, dentistry, laboratory classes. None of these are straightforward, and staff have been amazingly creative and students have been remarkably resilient in trying to deal with those. But what really blew me away during all this incredibly hard work, when staff were stressed themselves with their own difficult personal circumstances, worried about their health, worried about their jobs, worried about their partners and their families, that they just kept coming through for students, and really, particularly those vulnerable students, were forefront of staff minds. Griffith has always prided itself on being an institution that puts values at the centre. And one of the values that's widely shared, when I came to Griffith, it was just said to me over and over again by alumni, by professional staff, by faculty. Everybody wanted to say that we're a university that gives opportunities, educational opportunities, to students who might not otherwise have found their way into higher education. And I know some of you, if we were there meeting in person, I'd just love to hear the stories from alumni, and some of whom came through winding paths to Griffith, but have done some amazing things still. So our staff really focused on those students. In combination with community partners, we gave out over 11,000 meals to students who otherwise might have gone hungry. Our staff just spontaneously themselves started up food banks at a number of our campuses. We knew that many of our students couldn't afford computing equipment in their own homes. So during lockdowns, our library and IT staff have worked to give out our desktop computers to students for the duration of lockdowns, and students have always responded by very honestly bringing that back. Staff and alumni donated to student scholarships in record numbers. I was speaking just this morning to a student who was the recipient of one of those scholarships, just talking about the way that it had changed her life. She did have a very old computer. It broke down. Because of the scholarship that she'd received from alumni donations, she was able to get a new computer. If she hadn't had a computer, she just couldn't study at the moment. It wouldn't be possible because that computer has become absolutely critical. She was so grateful to our alumni. And I was talking to her about the fact, I was a recipient of a scholarship. I wouldn't have been able to study without that. So my husband and I are really happy to donate towards our scholarships. And I said, well, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, you'll be in that position too. And she said, absolutely. That's the Griffith way. And that is the Griffith way, because values are lovely on websites or corporate statements or, vice chancellor's chats. But it's the way that our community lives those values when it's under the most stress and pressure that helps to show that they're real. And I was really proud of our community. But it wasn't just those inside Griffith, it was also those we were partnering with. And we really just couldn't do what we do as an institution without incredible partners, schools, hospitals, creative arts folks in big institutions and small not-for-profits and industry. We do so much more in combination than we could do alone. And over the last year, that's included everything from working with a private sector corporation, Barbacore, on an artificial heart that may render heart transplants of living donations not required in the future. It's involved working with Gilmore Space, a startup space technology company, so that our students have opportunities to be involved in helping to literally build a low Earth orbit satellite which will go into space. We've worked with some of the cultural institutions when the Brisbane Festival, for example, last year wasn't able to go ahead. We've all got our fingers crossed for it being launched this Friday. Our students were amongst those who went out into suburbs where people were locked down and sung and performed on streets so that people could come to their front gates and hear some live music performances. We've worked with spinal cord injury with clinicians from our local hospitals, with private companies, with governments and with not-for-profits towards the amazing goal of helping people who are unable to walk because of spinal cord injury at the moment to one day be able to walk again. And we continue to work with international partners, challenging though that has been. Just one terrific partnership I wanted to draw to your attention because it was in the news again this week is the partnership between some of our archaeologists here at Griffith and archaeologists and people with local knowledge in Indonesia. And they've been working on a rock art project. And that project last year dated a sample of rock art in South Sulawesi, a wild boar, dated it as being 45,000 years old, the oldest dated example of its kind in the world. The international journal Science last year named the finding and dating of this rock art as one of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of 2020. To the best of my knowledge, the only Australian one in that top 10 list. And let me finally touch on place. That might seem like a really strange thing to be talking about at this point in time. Here we all are, not being able to meet in person, having to meet digitally. We've learned a lot about working digitally. It's great. We will not do things as we did them in 2019. We know much more about teaching online, collaborating online, researching online, having international engagements online, not being so carbon heavy as we used to be, flying here, there and everywhere globally and domestically. But place is still really important to us. Our physical campuses give us an anchor into particular communities, to Brisbane, to Logan, to the Gold Coast. And we want to be good neighbours. We want to be part of that community. We want to make differences in that community. Without wanting to rub it down to folks in Sydney and Melbourne, we are open at the moment. We're out of lockdown. And today I had to try and get some lunch, and the queues in the lunch for the couple of cafes that we had were so long I couldn't do it. I actually felt really happy about that because it is great seeing students back on campus able to have those serendipitous exchanges with each other and with their teachers and with other staff members that make university experiences wonderful. And because also we provide some really important services to the community that we're part of. On the Gold Coast, for example, the waiting list for those who didn't have private insurance that covered dental was years for people to get their teeth fixed. And in those times, people could go through awful pain, social embarrassment, and in fact develop quite serious health problems because they weren't getting their basic dental needs seen to. Since we've opened up our clinic run by our students and staff, which sees thousands of people every year, that backlog's been reduced to a couple of months. But of course, with lockdowns, it blew out again. So we just really want to make sure that we're being good neighbours, we're being part of the community, and we're providing those sort of services to people. And in doing that, we continue to gain global recognition. So this year we were ranked by the Times Higher Ed, which is a global ranking organisation, as 29th in the world for top young universities under the age of 50, and in the top 250 around the world. We had 3 disciplines in the top 10: tourism and hospitality, nursing and midwifery, and ocean and marine biology, ocean and marine engineering, incredibly important to the communities that we serve, incidentally, here on the coastal southeast Queensland. To have 3 disciplines in the top 10 for such a young university is really an amazing feat. So we do hope all of you, as alumni and friends of Griffith, have every reason to be proud of us. We are certainly proud of our diverse, amazing Griffith alumni. You've achieved so much during this time. We love hearing your stories, whether you're just doing something in your local community that's making a great difference to the people around you, or whether you're winning gold medals in the Olympics or Paralympics. Thank you for your support. We look forward to seeing you face to face again. Thank you particularly to those of you who provided financial support to our university, particularly our students in need, those who've given time as a mentor, as a guest speaker, an advisory board member, an industry advisory panel, just the occasional sounding board. We remain grateful to you. Tonight, in place of mingling drinks and canapes, we are going to have a great opportunity to hear some really fascinating thinkers on the topic of utopia. So let me hand back to the wonderful Ashley Hay, the editor of the Griffith Review and a great member of the Griffith community as well, to get us started. Thanks, Ash.
Carolyn, thanks so much for that lovely, lovely wrap up and those lovely words. Lovely to have you in our space this evening, as always. I need to just clear through a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get into the important part of bringing the panelists into the room. First of all, from the alumni folk, if you'd like online activities such as these, they do have another webinar coming up called the Laughter Clinic, which I feel might be very useful, scheduled on the 14th of October. There's also a back catalogue of these events available on their YouTube channel. A couple of reminders about this strange online world we're in. If you have questions for the panel, you can ask these via the chat function on the usual right-hand side of Teams. It will not be open or accessible while we begin the panel discussion. It'll be opened up probably in about half an hour's time, and I'll make sure that we leave around 15 minutes at the end to try and get through as many of your questions as we can with the panel. I also need to let you know that this session is being recorded, which of course means that this content, like all the other content, will be shared at a later date. If you'd like to share any key learnings that you get from this evening, or simply carry on this conversation, the hashtag is Griffith Alumni on social platforms such as Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. I'm going to put a sneaky plug in for Griffith Review hashtags as well. So I'm delighted now to introduce you to our panel. We've got 2 contributors from our Hey Utopia edition, Danielle Sellermeyer and Amanda Tattersall, and we also have the Deputy Lord Mayor of Sydney, Councillor Jess Scully. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about each guest and their work as we go along, but I'm going to ask them now to unmute themselves and turn their cameras on so I don't feel like I'm sitting here on my own. Thank you all for joining me, for joining all of us in this strange and etherish way. As I said, I'm going to talk with our panelists for probably about half an hour now. I'll make sure we leave time for your questions. But let's start talking a bit about utopias. So this conversation grows out of Hey Utopia, our 73rd edition. The tagline for this book is Other Ways the World Could Be. It's a pretty useful space to be thinking into at the moment. It explores utopia in terms of how we think about space, place and people. It explores how we might change the way we think about change itself. It explores alternative visions, utopian visions for law, for government, for accountability, for poverty, for parenthood, for precarity, for pandemics, all sorts of things. It explores the past and the present and the future. And it explores the centrality of reckoning, which in Australia is a pretty important thing. So I'm going to start by asking all 3 of our guests to talk a little bit about this very powerful word, utopia, about the potentials and maybe the pitfalls of this idea or this aspiration. Amanda Tattersall, I'm going to annoy you first. Let me introduce you to everyone in the first place. Amanda is a community organiser, a researcher, a former official at Unions New South Wales. She founded the Sydney Alliance, she co-founded Get Up, and she's the host of the Changemakers podcast. Amanda is currently the Research and Education Lead at the University of Sydney's Sydney Policy Lab, and her piece for us, Scaling Change, is a wonderful memoir of living life at the biggest and smallest extremes, the fastest and slowest rates of creating change. Amanda, how does this word, this idea of utopia, resonate for you? Is it a daydream? Is it a distraction? Is it a valid kind of desire?
I remember the first time I sort of intellectually understood it was in a class in third year at university when I read all the utopias as Jess outlines in sort of the beginning of her book, you know, the Edward Bellamy's and the William Morris. And so in some ways it was initially like a philosophical and abstract concept. It then just became part of my life. Like, as I talk about in the book, I feel like I've tried to scale different forms of utopia in a sort of yearning to try and make change and make a place for myself, in a sense. And so I both had heady dreams for a quick, better world. You know, I talk in the piece about the battle around the war in Iraq, and I was very deeply involved in that movement. I'm sure many people on the call were part of those protests in February 2003, and it broke my heart that it didn't work, you know, and I like, it was the biggest thing ever, the biggest protest that we have ever organised in human history. You know, even saying that phrase is an extraordinary thing, and yet we didn't change things. You know, the war happened. We're now watching what goes on in Afghanistan. Sometimes big is toxic, not just the bigness of war, but even the bigness of the response. We didn't do it. We didn't make the right change. And yet at the same time, I've also investigated the intimate and the small. You know, at the moment, I'm in deep conversation with my friends from the Muslim Women's Association, Muslim Women's Australia, who are in the heat of the lockdown in Sydney, right? Who are facing COVID, who are facing horrendous over-policing, who are facing a lack of healthcare responses. I met them through a small form of change making called community organising, where it's all about an intimacy and building relationships one-to-one. And so I talk in the piece about how, for me, in some respects, that's a different kind of utopia. You know, Danny talks about a grounded utopia, something that you build from the moment up, rather than thinking of it as a transcendent bolt of lightning that's going to hit you in the head. And I feel like I've just experienced these different ways of imagining throughout my career in change making. I don't think I would have thought that community organising, this intimate one-to-one work, was a utopia when I began, but I now know, having experienced the power of relationships, that you get a capacity to see something magical and extraordinary that we can experience it day to day, that actually can be with us, rather than thinking of it as over there. It can actually be here, like Jess writes in her book.
I love this idea that there are all these different species of utopia in a sense. I think that's one of the lovely things in our edition of Griffith Review, and also, Jess, in your book, which I'm just going to talk about as I introduce you. But this idea that it's not, of course it can't be a one size fits all, but there are really useful and potential tools of thinking about it as this sort of multi-purpose object. I'm going to come first of all, though, to Danny Sellermeyer, who's the professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Sydney, the Deputy Director Academic at the Sydney Environment Institute, and the convener of the Multi-Species Justice Collective. Danny's piece for us in Hey Utopia is a really rich and inspirational call to arms, I think, called Grounded Imaginaries. But before we talk about what these grounded imaginaries are and why they're critical to how we might navigate effective change in any sort of space, I want to bring the same kind of question to you, Danny, and ask you how this idea of utopia sits with where you are, and again, the sort of potentials or pitfalls of being caught up or imagining or aspiring to such a state.
Thanks, Ash, and such an honour to share the platform with these three women. You know, it's interesting reading the issue and also Jess's work. There's this parade of white men who thought about utopias. You know, Thomas More is like everybody's favourite to pull out. So instead of the white man species of utopia, I really love Octavia Butler, the Black feminist science fiction writer, and she talks about 3 types of utopian narratives: the what if, the if only, and the if this goes on. And what I really like about them is that they do 2 things. They orient you in a particular way, and they also have a certain affect. They make you feel a particular way. So the what if opens up this possibility of how might the world be. I think it's quite action oriented, it's quite practical. The if only, I think it's kind of dreamy, maybe a little bit fantastical. It has the whimsical about it. And of course, the if this goes on, we know it's the dread, it's the, you know, kind of taking you down the apocalyptic path. So my vote clearly goes to the what if. And I think I'm attracted to the what if because it makes 2 types of moves. Firstly, it denaturalizes the baked in ways of being in the world. And secondly, and I mentioned this earlier, I think it invites you to action, which is so critical in the work, I think, of many of the people, and certainly Jess and Amanda. So what if we didn't relate to the more than human world as commodity or resource? And then how would I be in the world? How would I walk through the world? What if, to reference some of the things that the Vice-Chancellor said, what if we valued care as much as we valued economic productivity of other sorts? How would we organise the economy if we did that? What if we recognise that actually interdependence and dependence is the natural way of being rather than a pathology? What would social security look like? So that opening up, that invitation towards a denaturalisation of how we just assume the world has to be, and then that move to do something about it. So that's the really critical part of utopia. I think often we think of utopia as this set of ideas that kind of float above reality. But, you know, I'm a materialist, right? So utopia always has to be, for me, enacted. And I know we'll come to that. But I want to say one thing about the dangers, because you asked about that as well. And, you know, my go-to person is always Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt wrote about the dangers of utopian thinking. She didn't put it in terms of utopia. But when we think that there is a blueprint for how the world ought to be, we give license to all sorts of violence, because then you've got to take this kind of messy way of being in the world and the messiness of humans, and you're authorized to shove them into the right way of being. So with that in mind, my utopia would be messy, full of conflict, and very material.
I love that. Thank you so much. Last but by no means least, let me bring Councillor Jess Scully, the Deputy Lord Mayor of Sydney, into this conversation. Let me introduce you to Jess as well. Jess was elected Deputy Lord Mayor of the City of Sydney in 2019 and has been a councillor since 2016. She'd previously founded Vivid Ideas, Australia's largest creative industries event, supported emerging talent through projects such as the Qantas Spirit of Youth Awards. She's a curator, a cultural strategist, and creative industries advocate. And she's the author, most recently, of the wonderful and inspiring guide, Glimpses of Utopia, Real Ideas for a Fairer World. Jess, thank you so much for joining us from Griffith Review for this conversation this evening. Can I start with this same question for you? How does this word utopia resonate with you? Is it useful, or are there things that it stops us from seeing or doing or understanding?
It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land tonight, so I just want to acknowledge that the elders past and present of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. You know, for me, actually, utopia is essential. I find it clarifying and it gives me energy and urgency. And I resisted and wrestled with the idea of the audacity of choosing a word like utopia. You know, I've always been accused of being an idealist or, you know, being impractical, and the idea of latching myself to utopia, which seems like the greatest, you know, act of dreaming, it seemed too much of a risk. But then I realized that actually I need utopia, because utopia for me is an assertion of hope and a belief that humans can work together in service of something greater than the individual. And it's but there are so many different kinds of utopias, and there are risks to utopias as well, as Danny and Amanda have highlighted too. And my utopia is a more pluralistic utopia, as Danny suggested, and it's one that's actually about recognizing potential. It's about being able to identify the seeds and the you know, what I call the glimpses of utopia. But that actually comes a series of ideas that come from Ernst Bloch, and the idea is of the not yet conscious, not yet become tendencies and latencies for utopias that are actually all around us. And I suppose for me, the book came from seeing these little instances, these pluralistic, you know, multi-faceted and completely individual and locally specific instances of utopia, or the audacity of trying to reshape the world in service of a greater good. And so that's why I wanted to collect them together, not to say that there's only one path, but we need to plant as many seeds as possible and water them all in the hope that we will get a new kind of forest. So that's but utopia is essential for me. You know, it's kind of the mission statement that we need. And where I landed with identifying a utopia for myself was the idea of eudaimonia, the idea of human flourishing. And if the aspiration for our shared endeavour as a society would be to unlock unfreedoms and to enable human flourishing, we would be in a better place. And there are infinite ways of getting there.
I think there's something really lovely of making it, giving everybody the opportunity to embody it or to take the idea on in a different way, that it's not just something you can have. I love that word audacity, something you can have the audacity to work towards as the Deputy Lord Mayor of a very large city, but of saying this is, you know, these potentials, these latencies are available in everyone. I want to come back to sort of talk about this, the way this speaks to some really important cause of being human, no matter what line of work you're in, or, you know, what you're sort of writing about or thinking about. But I want to talk a little bit to all of you now about what brought you all to be working in this kind of space. So there are different kinds of change making involved in the work that you each do. It's work that sits in different spaces, from academia to the sort of space of government to very grassroots intersections and interfaces. There are, you know, these sort of personal and political and philosophical aspects that overlay the work that all three of you do and the projects that you undertake. I wanted to start with you, Jess, and ask you, what brought you into the aspirational world? And I mean aspirational in the kind of best sense of wanting to make change, not only you know, undertaking it directly through some of your earlier projects, but now in the context of that kind of great big beast that I imagine, you know, sitting in the shape of the Sydney Town Hall and doing everything that it tries to do.
I think my family life has always been shaped by politics, you know, in that my mum, you know, came to Australia, you know, fleeing the coup in Chile, and you know, my dad came here as a migrant from India, and so and growing up in Western Sydney, you know, I experienced you know, in my life, the fact that not everyone has access to the same opportunities, and that opportunity is geographically distributed, and I could experience that difference. And so for me, the idea of being involved in politics was to try and address that, you know, the built-in inequality that prevents so much potential being realised. But I came to it in a roundabout way because I then was completely seduced by creativity and art and fashion and music and making, and spent, you know, 20 years working in that space, but with a conscious mission statement that I wanted to move Australia from the extraction to the creative and knowledge economy, and that I wanted to refocus our you know, our perception of ourselves on the idea that our greatest resource is not the stuff that we dig out of the ground, but the creativity and the talent, the global connections, and the diversity of our people. And so that's how I ended up then being invited to come and be a part of local politics, because the more time I spent trying to work on creative work and creative industries, the more I realized that the inhibitors were structural and political, and that was reinforced for me. And I realized that the only way I could have impact would be to get myself elected, or the best way that I could have impact, I suppose, is to get myself elected, because I got this particular set of skills, and that's kind of how it came about.
Danny, in the work that you do in your sort of research and your space, I wanted to talk a little bit about the interface that you explore between the desire for change, which can be sort of quite extreme and fantastic, and, you know, waiting for the bolt to kind of come down and change everything or deliver us all, and the possibilities of change in the real world of working, you know, where you are with what you have to hand, which is the sort of space you designate as grounded utopias. Do we need the extreme ideas of the utopia and the dystopia to actually activate us in the space that we live in? Or are they kind of a distraction? I'm quoting you here, that kind of can engender disengagement, that can lead us to feel very apathetic and very hopeless in a way. Is there a link or a ladder between those kind of fantastic extremities and what we can actually do here, or are they completely disconnected things? Oh, hang on, I think you might be on mute.
Sorry, I'm going to give you the "it depends" answer to that. I mean, it depends, right? For some people, it is the big picture that gets them moving, or it is the dystopian picture also that gets them moving. But what I argue in that piece is, and, you know, I want to ground it in climate change because that's what I'm writing about in that piece, that what we call the dominant narratives, the dominant imaginaries, it's another word for, you know, the kind of background understandings of the way that we think this could unfold, either, you know, business as usual, not a problem, or a techno fix, you know, either God or technology is going to save us, or else it's going to be an apocalypse. None of those seem to me to be action oriented. None of those are particularly helpful in allowing people to think about, you know, what do I do tomorrow, right? What do I do in my community now? They're all, they're abstract, they're remote, and they're not really, you know, I love this expression, they don't help you rebuild the ship at sea, right? Here we are with the systems that we're embedded in, with the knowledges that we have. And so, you know, in this project, you know, you talked about the personal, the philosophical, and the political. Thinking about grounded imaginaries is really like looking at what are communities, and, you know, Jess writes about this in her book, what are communities around the world, in Australia, for example, What are they doing to deal with the real problems that they're either facing as systems start to unravel in response to climate change, food systems, energy systems, you know, infrastructure and so on? What are the transformative changes that they're making in their communities now? And that could be, you know, teaching young people to refit houses so that they're adaptable to changing heat conditions. It could be regenerative farming. It could be solar, community-owned solar systems. And what's interesting about starting with that is the big ideas grow from the ground up, rather than, you know, we tend to think you start with the big idea, well, maybe some people do, and then you apply it. But this is a much more organic way of thinking about utopias. And my favourite example I learned from a colleague of mine, Anne O'Brien, who did some really interesting work with regenerative farmers. So, you know, I'm a hippie type. I work on multi-species justice. You know, I believe in the web of vitality of everything that we're embedded in. But, you know, your average Australian farmer really just wants to be able to grow things effectively. And as soil gets more and more degenerated because of the practices of farming that came with colonisation to this country, those ways of farming are becoming less and less viable within their own systems of desires. And so, you know, increasingly farmers are turning to different understandings of farming and to these regenerative agricultural models. And as they do that, there are just these wonderful stories of farmers discovering actually soil isn't this kind of inorganic resource. It's this like extraordinary set of relationships and life. And so, you know, from this very material, very instrumental beginning of dealing with a real problem, they find themselves in these very different sorts of relationships with the more than human. And that's also then transformative of what it is to be a human. So that's why the grounded work is so intriguing to me, because we think it starts in this quite prosaic way, but it actually blooms out to the possible in an unpredictable and wondrous way.
I want to stay out at that kind of level. Thank you. I'm jumping around my questions because I'm horrified to see that we've actually got next to no time left. So I'm going to remind all of you out there who I can't see that you can probably start sending your questions in. So I'm just going to skip through a little here, but I want to pick up on this, on the idea of this sort of blossoming of other ways of being human in response to understanding, you know, the activity and the potential and just the existence of all those other species. And Amanda, I want to bring this to you. It is a slightly large question for which I sort of apologise, but I want to explore the job of a change maker inside the kind of unique potential of being human. You know, here we are, we're these creatures with particular capacities for communication, for imagination, for memory. We can, you know, look behind us, foresight. We can see, you know, try and see in front of us and think about what's happened, reframe it, you know, reframe our sense of what's happened or what might happen next. Change making, adapting, creating, these kinds of words, is this just innately part of being human? Are we wrong to say that you've got to be a particular sort of person to be a change maker? Is that just part of the deal of humanity in a sense?
Well, I think so, right? Like, I think that, I mean, that's the nature of democracy, right? Is that we're actually all endowed with the capacity to choose a life together, to be able to emancipate ourselves. I mean, community organising has this iron rule that says don't do for others what they can do for themselves. It's based on the idea of people acting for themselves, like building power with each other, not power for or over another. You know, and I think, you know, the idea of a grounded imaginary is the idea that you can create a vision for the world that you want out of your experience in the same way that you can in the same way. And in the piece, that's what I mean when I talk about the importance of the small and the slow, right? I can talk about these dynamics of big and fast and small and big. And have spent a lot of time resting on the power of the small and the slow, just because it is where that grounding occurs. But, you know, like to think about the job, I mean, it's a big question, right? The job of a change maker. Like in the edition, there's that beautiful piece by Centels, who talks about the maker, and you know, change maker. You know, like I think it's worth emphasizing that it's there, that, you know, as she talks about, there's a practice to it. Like it's the practice of being able to make change. It's doing something in the day. It's action oriented, as Danny describes. You know, it's not just dreaming. It's just not philosophical dreaming. It's philosophical doing. And I do think that there are three qualities, actually. Like, let me narrow it down to sort of to areas that are really important for any change maker. The first is that you need to be relational. You need to actually care about others and to see yourself as growing and immersed in relationship with others. Now, to do that well, you need to be a great listener. You need to be able to interconnect and feel empathy, and also recognize that we're not the same, and relationships aren't a game of snap. And if someone is different to you, sit with their difference rather than pretend that we're the same, right? Difference, as Jess was saying earlier, is such a rich and important quality to be able to hold. It's also, though, you've got to know yourself. And the thing that I talk about a lot in the piece is that my coming to terms with my bipolar, right? Bipolar disorder. I had a psychosis when I was 19. It's been a battle throughout my adult life. Owning that challenge, understanding the dimensions of that challenge, seeing myself in a different way through the fact that I was able to move through and with that challenge, not really overcome so much as ride with its complexity, has been an incredibly important element in being able to build relationships with others, because it's about embracing our vulnerability. Like, we're not walking around being superheroes, which is another utopia, you know, that's presented on the television and in the movies, that somehow we have to be a superhero. We don't. Being relational is about knowing all of our weaknesses and knowing that they can be strengths, because they can be a means to which others can connect with us. But just quickly, there are two other qualities that are important too. The second is an understanding of power. Now, people often freak out about that because they have bad experiences with power, but that idea of building power about creating things together, about building powerful, meaningful, accountable relationships with one another is critical. Can't get anything done if you can't act, and power means the ability to act. And then the third quality that's important is grappling with uncertainty. And I think that that's that grounded imaginary as opposed to a transcendental idea of utopia, which is we are not in full command of everything that is around us, and we never will be. And we're kidding ourselves if there's a blueprint to life. And recognizing what we can do and what we can't do. And, you know, the serenity prayer is a phrase I always use all the time, you know, like being able to place ourselves in the uncertainty and the tension of that, and to live with that uncertainty, to make change. I mean, change making, what an arrogant posture, you know, like what an arrogant posture. The world is capable of changing itself, but we do still have a role. We can act, even if it feels hard. There is the possibility, there isn't a dystopia. We have the capacity for action, and being able to find and identify that in the space is critical too. So they're my jobs. For what can a change maker be? Relational, understand power, and understand and appreciate and act within uncertainty.
I think the world has given us an absolutely magic moment to pause and sit with the experience of uncertainty. I'm conscious that I say that as the person who's walking back out into the unlocked down city at the end of this conversation. But I want to pick up on that, Jess, and ask you if you have a sense that maybe how people think about change, about reformation, about rupture, maybe even about quite radical change, has itself been changed by the last, 20 months or so that we've come through, with the disruption of the pandemic, with the potential that can come from those kinds of moments of rupture?
I have to believe yes, but I have to say that I'm more cautious about it than I was, after the first lockdown.
Mm.
I think it's easy for the forces of the status quo to be well prepared and well resourced to keep rolling out business as usual. And it's much harder for everyone who wants to put forward alternatives to be poised and ready to act, because often they are those who have they aren't organised, they don't have the resources, they don't have the megaphones and the stages. And so what I wanted to do with my book was to put forward a smorgasbord of things to protest for and not just things to protest against, to be able to say, here is a selection of prototypes that we could embark upon and trial where we are, whichever ones work for our conditions and our communities. But it's hard to do that when you're also homeschooling kids, and when you're precarious labor, and when you're disconnected from family and support structures, and when you're in super lockdown suburbs, or it's harder to do that work. And so a year ago, I was thinking, yes, this is the moment. This is the crisis that we've been waiting for, and let's throw the book at them. And now I'm more cautious and less assured that we're going to get that, because what did we get? We got the government putting forward a gaslit recovery, essentially, and I know I'm supposed to be relentlessly optimistic in this portion, but I'm not, because what I've experienced in the past 5 years in an elected position is that I only hear from people who are already privileged, and I only hear from people who don't like how anything is right now, but would like it all to continue exactly the same way, please. So what I've been calling for, and what I'm working on at the moment, is trying to give the majority the access to some of the tools that minority have access to. And I know Amanda's been working on things like that her whole life, and it's not new, but I'm trying to adapt some of those tools for the Instagram generation, I suppose. And I never hear from people who are renters, who are, under 60. I never hear from people who come from diverse backgrounds. And I don't hear from them at a local level, and I think they rarely engage with government at other levels in ways that governments hear. And so what I would like to see more of, and what I want to play a part in, is encouraging, empowering and supporting active citizenship, but in the time between elections, and doing so in ways that are really targeted and local, because climate action in a concrete way means a cycleway on your street rather than parking. It means a tree instead of a parking space. It means affordable housing, not more luxury flats, but you have to fight for every single one of those outcomes. And I need the people who are willing to fight for those to work together in ways that are locally locally appropriate and attuned. And so I think the moment is here, but are we ready for it is probably my answer, Ashley.
Thank you for that. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to sneak in a couple of questions that have just started to come in. We've got one which, Danny, I'm going to give to you, because I think there might be a really interesting intersection here with the idea of grounded imaginaries. It's a question from Greg talking about the panel's vision about a utopian vision for Australia's elderly population and their purposeful interaction with children and school students to improve relational skills, mutual health, behavioural, social benefits. Greg's question is, why do we continue to segregate these groups? Now, Danny, is this part of where grounded imaginaries work, because they are saying, not just look at the sort of tangible resources of where you are, but look at the human resources as well, and look at what you've got to work with in that kind of space?
I actually think Greg started to answer his own question in a way that demonstrates exactly what Jess and Amanda were talking about. Like, people have great ideas. I might just answer the question a little bit differently. I'll come back to the grounded. But, part of the problem, and this is the notion of imaginaries, that we see people as belonging in particular spaces. Old people belong here, children belong here. And that's what's wonderful about Utopia, going back to what I said right at the beginning. We can denaturalize that. Those forms of organisation, those categories of identity and the meanings that we associate with them, they're all made up, right? They could be otherwise. There's no necessity for, look at how we live, you know, the idea that people live with the people that they're having sex with and the ones that they had that they gave biological birth to, right? That is an arbitrary form of living together, which has become so naturalized that you have to kind of pick it up and throw it on the table and break it open to see that it could be otherwise. So I think it's just a wonderful question of saying there are a whole lot of ways in which those baked in ways of organising identity groups are leading to terribly deleterious outcomes. I mean, over and over and again, something that I'm hearing in this lockdown, being in Sydney and New South Wales, is just the dreadful loneliness that particularly older people are feeling, for whom, you know, those of us who complain about Zoom, but at least we're on Zoom, right? For whom those modalities of being in relationship aren't available. So I think going back to those forms of reorganisation and saying who actually needs to be together, what are the skills that people have, what are the skills that older people have, what are the needs that younger people have? It's a beautiful question. So, you know, I think it's just a great example of when we think differently, we can come up with different ways of organising society. But going to what Jess said, then we need the institutions to support it, right? The idea isn't enough. Then you need to change the built environment and the institutional structures so that those possibilities can be nourished.
I want to pick up on that, Danny, thank you, and scoop in some of what you've said there with, a question which has just now disappeared because now everybody's asking questions when we've got 2 minutes to go. Amanda, I think these two things come into the point that you made when we were speaking on our previous event for the launch of this edition, and you referred to it a little before, of the need to, in understanding being truly relational, the need to speak across difference, to find those connections. Now that can be in terms of something generational, but we've got another question as well talking about, you know, the disruption of the pandemic has made people a lot more frightened, a lot more conservative, and how do you then find the way of speaking out to that difference? You know, how do you sit with that that fear and kind of bridge the gap rather than rejecting the point of difference?
Yeah, so I mean, this is where the power of slow is essential, you know, like because a fast push is going to create a polarization that's going to damage a cause, in a sense. This work reminds me of the work that I'm doing around climate change at the moment. So, you know, climate change is not going so well in Australia, in case people went across that detail. And it's been very polarizing on all sides. Say, you know, the climate movement has made some mistakes, as well as there's been a really nasty reaction to calls for climate action in coal and fossil fuel communities, right? And that's a really difficult situation, right? So this project that we're working on, that's partly inspired by the Green New Deal in the United States, but in practice we're doing it quite differently. It's called the Real Deal, because we're Australian and we use funny language like that. And we're building place-based projects in the places where, you know, where Jess is talking about the people who we need to reach are not stepping in, right? You know, people who play by the rules, of people who are already resourced enough to know how to do it. We need to speak to a different set of people. So in Gladstone in Queensland and in Geelong and West Melbourne in Victoria, we're building these place-based projects where we're talking to all the different communities across those places. So we're talking to the different union leaders. We're working our way to be able to build a relationship with the mining union up there, as well as with the Australian Conservation Foundation, who's playing a leading role. And it's about sitting in that space and not necessarily pretending that we're here to fix all the problems, right? We're not here to necessarily reconcile someone's inbuilt perspective on the merits of a coal economy versus not. but they all have a common interest in the place that they're in, and that if there is a crisis brought by climate change, that's going to change all of their lives. And that question or that provocation creates a different kind of conversation where they do have a common interest, in that they all have an interest in being able to see how they can respond to the challenge that arises, despite and I've done that before, you know, in the Sydney Alliance 100 years ago when I was working on that using community organising. People might remember there was a flotilla, and the flotilla was coming down from Turkey to Israel, and it was causing in Sydney some real stress, really understandable stress between the Jewish community and the Muslim and community in the Arab Council. Now, all those groups, the Jewish Board of Deputies, the Muslim Women's Association, the Arab Council, all in the Sydney Alliance, and let me confirm, they didn't have the same position on the flotilla or Palestine, right? But they were all in the Sydney Alliance, and they didn't want to see a fight about that issue destroy this group. And so they ended up coming together and having a conversation about how they could agree to disagree in public, how they were going to talk about each other in a way that was civilized and respectful and understanding. So sometimes what you find as agreement isn't what you think you should be finding, but it's something else. It's a different grounded imaginary between different groups that can be cultivated when there is a relationship and some level of trust. And I think those elements, they're sort of tools of organising, but we'll be surprised. No one will go into any place where there is a mix of different interests, conservative, progressive, different ethnicities, identities, and anyone who goes in there thinking they know what the outcome is going to be is a fool. What you need to go in there is you need to listen, you need to have your full heart, you need to be open, and you need to explore what's possible to be built together. And you always can build common ground with that intention.
I'm so sorry to say to all of you that it is 2 minutes past 7, so I've gone over the extra bit of time that the very nice advancement people told me I could have. I'm just going to say to Paul Ross, who's asked a question about universal survival income or universal basic income, there's a great piece in this edition of Griffith Review by Lee McInerney, who writes about discovering that for her that's actually what JobKeeper was, and she was running the experiment of just how productive and creative one can be. Thank you all so much for being part of this conversation. It flew by. I'm so sorry that I didn't get to all the messages that are still coming in and all the questions that are still coming in. Thank you to everyone who sent one in, and I'm sorry we couldn't answer them all for you. I wanted to make a quick mention of some of the other great pieces and writers that we've got in this edition of Griffith Review. I'm not really sure what you think about a book called Hey Utopia, but one of the things that pleases me so much as the person who had the very great privilege of bringing it together is how very warm and generous and rich so many of these voices are. People have really shared not just some fantastic ideas, but wonderful experiences that they've had, wonderful moments of connection that they've had in their own thinking and their own living. I think that's that gives it a really important tone or possibility to celebrate in a group of words on pages at the moment. To mention a couple of the writers very quickly, there's a wonderful piece by Professor Julianne Schultz, who's the publisher and founding editor of Griffith Review, a piece by Bryony Doyle, Jane Gleason-White, a fantastic piece by the award-winning bachelor artist Fiona Foley, the American writer Sarah Centelise, who Amanda mentioned earlier, and the award-winning Munanjali writer Ellen Van Nieuwen. One of my particular favourites is a piece of fiction by Alex Cothran, who writes a utopian history of America in which the country's citizens have the right to arm bears rather than the right to bear arms. And it is really lovely to read where that leads them. Thank you all so much for your participation in the strange ether world of audience at the moment. I can appreciate many of you will have spent hours staring at screens today. We're very grateful to all of you for giving us another hour of your attention this evening, and I hope you enjoyed it. There'll be an email going out in following weeks with a link to the recording of this conversation. The email will also have a short event feedback survey, so you can say, Ashley Hay should have asked more of the audience questions, and I will absolutely take that on board. If you could please complete the survey and send it back, it will help the alumni folk to continue to improve what they offer. If you'd like to know more about alumni engagement, how to stay involved with Griffith University, get in touch, search for them on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, etc. I just want to thank again Carolyn for coming along and sharing her observations of those strange last 20 months with us. It's always lovely to know that she's in the room. That was really wonderful. And I would ask, it's always a bit useless at this point, but if you can join me in the silence of the live stream world to thank our three wonderful panelists for their warm and very generous conversation with us tonight. Danielle Sellermayer, Jess Scully and Amanda Tattersall. Thank you all, everyone, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of your evening.